I'm Rick from Carthage Classic Cars. On this video, we're back on what's left of the '69 Firebird. In the last video, you saw we cut this whole car apart to pretty much what was left. It was pretty much a rusted shell at this point. On this video, we're gonna go and we're gonna take it and we're gonna sandblast it, and the goal at the end of this video is to get an epoxy. So stay tuned. I'll show you how we got it to this point in the blasting phase, and then we'll come back. I'll show you the next couple steps on what we're gonna do.
The good thing about my frame jigs is while supporting the car, we could take the levelers up and they're still mobile. So I could sit there and load them up on my rollback, drop it off down the road. We have the blaster set up away from everyone where the noise wouldn't bother anything. I mean, we live out in the country anyway, so it doesn't really matter that much. But still, we do have people somewhat close by. We can be away from them. We're not by the garage or anything, blasting sand out in front of it. And you see, we're going to just drop this car off. We're kind of in the shade a little bit. I have a good spot here that's easy to clean up. The good thing about the wet blasting too is it's doesn't have a dust cloud that travels pretty far. You know, it's all gonna stay down on the ground. There's no cloud. We only have to wear a face shield. But what I'm doing on this Firebird, I'm basically setting up the legs. I don't care about being level. This is more so while I'm blasting, it doesn't move. You can see the blast setup on the right. That's the Equip EQ600. It's a wet blaster, a vapor blaster, and you can see the compressor is behind us. So here we are in the wet blasting phase. You can see we're going to start spraying, and you really see, I mean, this is sped up. I'm adjusting the media and the water output a little bit, but once we get dialed in, it really does move pretty quick. Obviously, we're still in time lapse. This whole car right here, including the front subframe and the bumper area, took me about 2 hours to blast and also wash down. That's of compressor runtime, not the time it took, you know, to set up or anything else. So I know there's a lot out there that says if you wet blast a car, you ruin it. You know, it's going to rust down and road it in the future and all that, etc., etc. So my opinion on the wet blasting, where the rust comes from is we're using a medium grit crushed glass. So we're calling it sand, but it's really recycled glass. But what happens is it clumps up. You ever go to the beach and you know you have that wet beach sand, how it just gets stuck everywhere. The key to wet blasting is you need to be able to wash the car out. If sand holds in areas of the car, corners and everything else, and stays there, even though we're using a hold tight 102 in the water, which is a rust preventative up to I think it's 72 hours, if that sand is sitting there and it's holding moisture, that part of the car will start rusting on the bare metal. So the key to this whole wet blasting is to be able to wash the car out. That's why you see most of the time when we wet blast cars, they're mostly stripped anyway. You see, I did cut everything off this car, so it's easier to get in every corner. The sand doesn't stay in the car, easier to wash out, and we're not wasting valuable blast hours with media, water, and everything else on parts we don't not going to keep anyway. Obviously, the water costs money because the hold tight, the rust preventative stuff is kind of expensive, but it's worth its weight in gold. Obviously, this is one of those jobs you're going to be soaking wet when you're done. You're going to have sand everywhere. I could be wearing, you know, a set of coveralls or something like that, but I didn't mind that much. It's 90-something degrees today, so today's a day to be able to be wet and soaking wet. You're probably not going to see me in the middle of winter time, 20 degrees out doing this kind of job. But the benefits of sandblasting, the wet blasting versus dry blasting, I honestly, for a frame like this, I think the wet blasting is a little bit easier on the metal while also removing the rust. I think it keeps it cool. I think on this inner structure and how thick it is, it doesn't matter that much. I think the wet blasting in this situation is more operator friendly because, you know, they say you can wet blast external body parts without warping them. I disagree. I try to only do inner structure of car. But if I was dry blasting, I would have to wear so much more gear. I worry about the dust, the neighbors, everything else. That this is just so much more eco-friendly also, with being more efficient with the media. So like I said earlier, I think this is the most important part of the whole media blasting, which is the wash down phase. We don't have too much to wash down, but you see I'm going over everything starting on the top, working our way down. We got our Hold Tight 102 rust preventer in it. We had it since we started the blasting process. The idea behind this is it dries on the car and basically sets the area up to be painted, primed, whatever you're calling. But at this point, we're not adding any outside water to this process. What I also like to do when this whole thing is over, we'll go back through with a wire brush, a hand wire brush, and dig it out of any corners we might have missed, and then go through before we go to prime. And then once it dries, we're going to try to go with air and hit it really strong. Here's a couple pictures of the sandblasting process all complete back in the garage. You can see the car's really clean. We are going to add some OSFO on it just because you see it's already getting dark and I got a lot of other stuff to do in the car. We'll address that in a little bit. You can see right now we got an arc shot on the TIG welder. This is real-time speed. What I'm doing, I'm TIG welding the front subframe on the Firebird from the rear to front, front to rear, all the seams up. Coming from a racing background, this is the first thing we usually do on the race cars is we go ahead and just box everything in and weld it. Since the factory welds really are spotted, they go an inch stitch weld here, an inch there, and the welds really are real bad. So this is going to strengthen up the whole front subframe and everything. You can see I went over with a MIG welder on some of these other welds just because the factory welds are so dirty that anytime the TIG welder hits something, it just throws impurities, even with the sandblaster. So what I'm doing, I'm about 150 amps. I'm using 1/8 inch filler rod on a 3/16 tungsten on a gas lens. It's a blue hybrid tungsten that's like an all-in-one tungsten. I'm DC welding and I'm just running down this. What was really cool about welding this front subframe is really usually I weld 18 to 22 gauge. So for a chance I really got to crank up my TIG welder and really run some solid passes on thicker metal.
Now that you see how the whole wet plasting process works in general, let's go ahead and take a look at the car. You could see it's a different shade than when it was sandblasted as far as this subframe. You can see the subframe, we did weld up most of the underneath on the subframe just to make it a little stronger. But why this looks a different color is I put some OSFO on it. OSFO is basically a rust preventer, rust remover, converter. So we went and we put this car in the OSFO. The reason being we did two cars. We did sandblast another car at the same time since we had the blaster out. So between that and all the work that we had to do on the front end, I knew last night that I just didn't want to take a chance of the car having to flash rust. So what I did, I'm going to show you on this subframe, because actually the subframe here, we did miss a couple spots when I was blasting, just it was hung upside down. So what you're going to do, like I said, OSFO, it's in a bottle. You get it pretty much at any hardware store. Wear gloves, and let's pretend I have a respirator on because this is acid, so use your safety gear. But basically you want to put a very little bit of this on. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to just, and be aware, since it's acid, don't get it on your floor or anything. So I just put a little bit on, and I take a damp rag, and I'm just wiping it down on the whole little bit of the bare metal. So, and the reason I'm putting it on this subframe too, it'll convert the rust, and it's gonna enable me to let me work on this subframe for a couple more days and just do a couple more tweaks on it before we go ahead and actually epoxy. We are gonna go ahead and epoxy the car beforehand, but same thing around here, we'll go a little bit heavier, but I'm gonna just dust it on. And then what I don't want any residue. I just want to come and stay like that. So we would do the whole subframe that way. Like I said, using a ventilated area. As soon as we get done with the video, I'll turn all the fans and everything on, and then we'll go ahead and put a respirator on while we're using this stuff. But there you go. You can actually just get the rag damp and wet it on. So that's how the OSFO goes, and then you'll see this in about an hour or so, maybe even shorter, 30 minutes, will actually start turning black. I don't think this car has any on it, but if you saw any rust areas left over, that would turn black. Now, With the OSPO puts its acid, so it has an acidic surface. I've never had a problem with the epoxy primer we use, but look over the TDS sheet of the paint you use to make sure you can spray it over that. Most epoxies should be good. However, what I do like to do before we go ahead and actually paint or put our weld through primer on this thing, I'll take some lacquer thinner. And now everywhere I went with the OSPO, I want to neutralize the acidic level. So we'll go ahead and we'll spray, and I'm heavy with the lacquer thinner. I'll do one area and we'll kind of just go over it with a red Scotch-Brite. And then so if the OSPO is on any heavier, if you see any scaly areas, if you watch my video on the OSPO on the Challenger roof, you'll see how it can get scaly. If you do run into any of that, it'll actually take it off with the scuff pad. You can see it's a little bit gray there. So that's going to give us a good prep surface so we could go ahead and the next step, adding the weld through primer. So let's go ahead. I'm going to take care of this whole car. I already did the other car where we blasted last night. So that one's all done, and then we're going to go ahead and shoot our weld through primer on both cars, and then the next step is the epoxy phase. So stay tuned. We're not going to epoxy for another day. Oh, that's another thing with the OSPO. You can't paint on it for 24 hours. So right now, this car and the other one, we're 24 hours the next day using this. It's the end of the day now. So be aware you can't use it, paint over for 24 hours. So stay tuned. Let's get working on this car and we'll come back.
Now that we're 24 hours after we applied the OSPO, we got all the lacquer thinner wiped down on the car. It evaporated. The car is all clean, neutralized. We're now applying the weld through primer. At this point, if you forget an area, it's not the end of the world. I also want to point out, even from the time that the car came out sandblasting, do not touch this bare metal with no gloves and your bare hands. Your grease, everything in your skin will contaminate the paint. You see, I'm not wearing gloves right now. I was wearing gloves before. It's just one of those things. I don't plan on touching the car with my hands right now using the spray can. So we're just going to apply the weld through primer and we're going to sit overnight. Here we are at the next day. We're getting our epoxy mixed up and shaken in the paint shaker to get going. You see, I don't have gloves on right now because the gloves really stick to the tape and starts pulling them apart. But the only thing I'm really touching is the tape. I'm trying to be really conscious about me just touching the tape. Sometimes I will be touching the weld through primer, but under no circumstances, at best I can, like I said earlier, I'll be touching the car's bare metal on the sandblast surface. That's also an area that will create a rust spot. But I'm going through, I'm taping up everywhere we put the weld through primer. Honestly, with this, I missed 1 or 2 spots. If you do that, you just got to come back through later and you'll just have to do a little more work sanding it down. That's what I'm doing right now. Basically, with this tape and the weld through primer, since the car's already bare metal and I prepped it before sandblast as far as getting all the old metal off of it, I'm able to just cover up these areas, put the weld through primer, and then once we pull the tape off, the car's already ready for the new panel. So if we out, like I said, 1 or 2 spots we missed, we'll come back through it with the sanding disc, something to remove that epoxy down to bare metal, and then we'll just spray on the weld through primer in the can. Same thing, there's 1 or 2 spots I taped up here. I realized I missed the weld through primer. I'll just go back through and spray it over the epoxy when we're done. Here we are. We're going to go ahead and mix our epoxy primer. On the Firebird, we are going to use the MP170. It's a black epoxy primer. The key here is you need to look at the TDS sheet. On the TDS sheet, this epoxy calls for 2:1 to half a part acetone mixing ratio. You could see I'm also mixing a white epoxy. So we're going to spray the Cuda next to it, the one that we sandblasted, and the Firebird at the same time. How I'm doing this, I'm adding my one part after the two parts, and I'm topping them off with the acetone. I'm mixing both these primers, and there's a 15-minute induction period. So the goal is I'm mixing up these two first batches, and then what I'm going to do, I'm going to go back from one to another, and as the next one's inducting, I'm spraying the epoxy before it and jumping back car to car because we need to flash time. What I'm writing down on my makeshift old trunk floor table is how much epoxy I'm using. Basically, it's real simple. How I do epoxy, I charge by the ounce. So it's just easy for me as I'm pouring in. I know how many ounces I'm using. All in all, between both of these cars, we used 1.5 gallons of epoxy. So the white Cuda took most of it up. You know, obviously the Firebird doesn't spray that much. The thing about the epoxy too is when you sandblast, it soaks it up a whole lot more versus hand stripping it with like a DA and everything. So you see, I got them both into disposable mixing cups. I put a cap on one of them, and now we're going to shoot the Firebird first in the gun. Once that's done, we're waiting for it to flash. We're going to go back over to the Cuda. The primer gun I'm using here is a DeVilbiss starting line gun. I'm running my air pressure about 30 psi at the gun, and really just a consistent flow coming out. Checking my spray pattern. I don't have the trigger pulled back all the way. I pretty much bottom it out and then turn back down the paint flow about 1.5 turns. You see, I'm kind of working that process. I'm starting at the top of the car and I'm working my way down, trying to keep a wet edge all the time. So basically, wherever the paint is wet, I'm adding paint to the end of it so it flows in and it basically sticks to each other. At that point, once we're done with that section of the car, we will not reapply epoxy until the car flashes over. So this has, give or take, 15 to 25 minutes of a flash time, that depending on humidity and temperature. About 20 minutes before this, in North Carolina, it was torrentially downpouring outside. You see it's nice and sunny right now, so it's hit or miss on this, but you'll be able to tell because the paint will go from a shiny kind of black to that dull finished black when it's all said and done. And you'll be able to touch a corner without leaving the imprint or your glove sticking. So that's how you know the paint's flashed over. You want to make sure your epoxy is flashed over before you keep applying more, because it's releasing the solvents in the primer. This goes for paints, everything else. That's where you get the solvent pop and everything else, or it bubbling up. And it's just, if you pile on epoxy, paints, primers, everything on top of each other without letting it breathe out and let the solvents escape, that's where you have issues. So follow your TDS sheet. Everything I'm painting is written for you on a TDS sheet by the book. If you can read the directions and follow them, you lessen your chance of having a major crisis down the road. So this car and the car next to it both got 2 coats of epoxy. The first coat really is going to soak up in the sandblasted material, and then the second coat really is the smooth, lay it out, protecting coat. You see right now that both coats have flashed out. It's dry. It's got that dull look to it. We're going to go back through and just remove all the tape. Now with the tape, I didn't say it earlier, I used the cheapest tape. Some of it you could see kind of flapping up as I'm priming. That's the whole idea. I don't want to use a really aggressive tape and be ripping off the weld through primer. So even if it doesn't have a hard edge, it's not the end of the world. For the most part, this tape did its job, and this is exactly what I like to use it for. You could see how everything's prepped, and we got some rust repair, but we're on and getting ready for the next stage and assembling the new parts. Here's a couple shots of the car all completed. Everything's done on it. You know, there's not that much left of the car, but all in all, the epoxy is now protected. You could see some rust holes here and there that we need to address, but in general, I think this is much better protected than the factory would have ever done a Firebird in this sense. And you could see as we were ripping apart, there was bare metal everywhere, and why these cars were so rusted underneath. Same thing with the subframe. It's really protected and ready for the future use.
All right, so we're going to wrap up the video on the 69 Firebird. You saw everything we did with our sandblasting, our bare metal preparation, and now the car's in epoxy primer. You also see we did our subframe. I welded all the seams down the subframe. We TIG welded it, and around some of these seams right here, I did MIG weld it. Not everything is completely TIG welded. Do I think it's worth doing that? No, it's not worth. If someone came up to me and said, hey, can you do this? It's really not worth it. But for me and my racing background and being it's my car, it's something I personally want to do. And I just think it's cool when you look down it and you see something that's not factory. You see, we were real busy. We also did epoxy this CUDA. I have a certain process. I did both cars at the same time, and that's why it took a little bit longer. But efficiently, did the same process in taping up everywhere we're gonna weld. And you see this one's white, the Firebird's black. So the key is, well, what epoxy do you use? Do you use a white epoxy or do you use a black epoxy? Really, it comes down to user preference. The epoxy is mostly there in this stage to protect bare metal. Some people use a thinned out epoxy as more of a sealer, and if that's the case, your sealer would have to be kind of the color you're going. You don't want to put, white on top of a black car if you're going to seal it. Now, on the flip side, the reason this car is black, I'll give you a little bit on what I'm thinking is the chassis of this car is going to be painted black. It's a GM car. So now that we've done black, if we're doing chassis paint or something all on the inside and I miss something, we already got the black epoxy to hide behind versus a gray or a white. I think the white epoxy over here, you could see more imperfections. You can see where the vinyl top holes are for this car. I don't know if you could see them on the camera, but everywhere you could see rust holes on this car, and everything stands out a lot easier. So sometimes this bright white is easier to work with. So it really, like I said, it's personal preference. It's what you want to do. We're going to be putting black E-coat parts on both of these cars. So really, the epoxy is your base coat. Another good thing about having a darker epoxy is really if you do a white 2K and anything else, your high build primers are white, when you start sanding down, when you hit the black, you know it's time to stop because you're about to hit bare metal, which really the white is going to stand out a little bit too, not as easy as the black. So all in all, that's where we're at. You see the same thing on the Firebird. Everywhere we put our weld through primer should be ready to go for the most part. We still have metal work to do in the car. You can see back here, there's holes here and there. I didn't have time when we were sandblasting to sit there and get to every hole. So really, before the next video, I'm gonna go through this car front to back, and I'm gonna look at every rust hole, and I'm gonna start welding and fixing our small patch sections. If we had to take every panel off this car that needed a little repair, there would literally be nothing left. This is all that was somewhat good on this car. So we're gonna do that while we're gone, just to know this is the process. We do this because it's easy to rip apart the parts, sandblast the only things we need, put it in an epoxy, what we're gonna keep, and now we start building on the car. When we come back on the next video on this Firebird, the next thing we're gonna do is we should be starting installing parts. We're gonna start with the rear frame rails and work our way forward and work on the floor pan. I have a process, I have an idea on how it's gonna go, so stay tuned and we'll try that out. As far as the parts, the good thing is I ordered most of these parts already. I got, right now, half the car is gonna be full AMD, the other half is gonna be Dynacorn. I went straight to AMD and ordered my parts for anyone that thinks I'm being sponsored and, hey, you should, be nice to build a car like this when the parts are given for free. Nothing on this car right now is given for me for free. If anyone knows anyone that wants to throw parts at this car, reach out to me. The good thing about not being sponsored is I kind of give my honest opinion on everything. So AMD, I think, and Dynacorn, which half the cars will be Dynacorn too. We have every single part. I think they're the best of the parts. I do have one good mark door and one good mark inner front fender for the car, inner wheel housing in the front, and that was just left over from the F-body project that someone just left it here for me. So we're gonna test fit those. It might come out okay. If I don't like it, we'll go ahead and order the match door for the car. But shout out to Erin at the installation center. She was actually a Dynacorn dealer that helped me out in ordering the parts, and I gave her a list. So if you don't want to go through Summit, Jegs, and you want to find someone that could find all the parts at certain warehouses and get the parts shipped to you, go check her out. So that's where we're at. Like I said, if anyone has any questions on the car, we're going to do a full build on the car. I really think this is the way to do it and get a good solid car when it's all said and done. We cut out all the rust. We got rid of all the rust. We're going to fix a couple patches and we're going to start the build process. So stay tuned. Hopefully this Firebird kind of gives you ideas and motivation on your car. Like our videos, subscribe to our channel. We're trying to do more and more of this. It's going to be a couple weeks before we really get back on this car, being all the small patching we got to do. But once the videos start on the next build process on this car, the GM cars are awesome because they are really big pieces. They just, you put a floor in, half the car looks like it's done. So I don't think it's going to be that long on the build process, but stay tuned and we'll see what we can do. So I'm Rick from Cartridge Classic Cars, and we'll see you in the next video.